Hi, my name is Joel Rinsema. I'm the Managing Artistic Director with Kantorei, and I'm here with a new friend to me and to Kantorei, Dr. Seth Ward. It's great to spend some time with you today.
It's great to be here, thank you.
So we've got some concerts coming up, our December performances, our holiday performances, and this year we're doing an entire set of some pieces that are new to me and new to Kantorei. And the title of our concert is Miracles. And so when I was looking at different repertoire to try to fit around the theme of miracles, we're doing a whole set of pieces, Milagros de Navidad, which are all Spanish carols from a bunch of different Spanish-speaking countries, but really started to look at some of the Hanukkah pieces that were out there and decided to do a set, again, of new music to me and new music to the choir, of pieces that were, I don't know if they were directly, and you're going to tell us more about this, but that are related to the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. I think for our Kantorei members and also our patrons, I think we begin at the very beginning, which is, what is Hanukkah? That's a celebration that a lot of us aren't familiar with.
Well, Hanukkah is the festival of lights. The justification for the festival, as it would be recited by most people, is that there was a miracle of oil in the sanctuary. The Syrian Greeks, the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, had prohibited Jewish observations. They had prohibited Sabbath and the Jewish calendar and circumcision, and had entered the temple and defiled it as far as traditional Judaism is concerned. When the armies of Judas Maccabeus, as he's sometimes called, when the armies of the Hasmoneans entered the temple and purified it, the traditional thing is that there was the miracle of the oil that should have lasted for one day, but lit the lights for 8 days. Now, the earliest sources talk about lighting the lights and a kind of impromptu menorah, candelabrum, that was used for lighting the lights. And one of the texts that you're singing, Al Hanissim, is on the miracles, and that talks about the miracles that a small, disorganized band of, calling it an army, a band of soldiers under the Maccabeans was able to take back the temple and take steps which eventually led to an independent kingdom. And that kingdom, as it's called in Jewish studies, the Hasmonean kingdom, made Hanukkah, you might say, their celebration of dedicating the temple, and made it a kind of model of the Jewish festival of tabernacles, of Sukkot. And so that, I think, is the real reason. It was instituted by the Hasmonean dynasty, the successors of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, as a national festival for the Jews.
So in your tradition, what kind of celebration is it? You mentioned the lighting of the menorah. Is it a family celebration? Do families gather during Hanukkah? I know it's not one of the major festivals or feast days of the Jewish calendar, but what can one expect growing up in a Jewish household?
Growing up in a Jewish household, one would expect that there is a Hanukkah menorah, possibly one for each member of the family. It has 9 places for candles or for oil, and 8 of them are on one level and one of them is raised. And it is lit every evening. 1 candle plus the middle or the one on a higher level, which is called shamash. That's the one that's used to light the others. 1 candle on the first night, 2 on the second, up to the full night where you have 8 candles plus the shamash. You use 44 candles in all, or not that much oil if you have an oil device. And that would be the common denominator of most Hanukkah celebrations at home. In the synagogues, there probably would be a Hanukkah menorah. There might be an electric one that's lit all the time with the appropriate number of lights. Now, in addition to that, there are traditional foods, as there are with most holidays, with most traditions around the world. For Hanukkah, they are potato pancakes and jelly donuts. Why? Well, they're both fried with oil. And the miracle was that the oil lasted for 8 days. There are probably other reasons too, but those are the traditional dishes. You have a song about the Dreydl. It was a tradition of playing in Eastern Europe, probably doesn't go back more than 100, 200 and some odd years. But the story came to be told that when the Greeks prohibited studying Torah, the boys, they were probably only boys who were studying, would have these tops. And whenever the Greeks came by, they would play with tops and, play for nuts or whatever, gambling. The Dreydl has 4 letters, one which means do nothing, one which means take the whole pot, one which makes take half the pot, and one which says put something in.
And so is the Dreydl, the game, is that just something people play during Hanukkah time, or is that, I think most of the people listening to our conversation here know the song Dreydl, 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 I made it out of clay. The one that we're singing is a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but is the Dreydl something that is a Hanukkah time?
Dreydl is connected with Hanukkah. I don't know, if you were growing up in a Jewish household, I don't know that you would play Dreydl except in connection with the Hanukkah. You might have artistic Dreydls as bought as a souvenir hanging up on a shelf or something like that.
So, on to our Dreydl, spin Dreydl. We've got all of these pieces, are centered around Hanukkah, and you're going to talk about some of the texts, but this one is actually a little bit different. What's interesting about this program is that all of these pieces come from different parts of the world, and so that's why we've kind of built this concert as a concert about pieces from around the world. This piece is in Yiddish, which it's been quite a challenge for our singers, because just when we think we're getting some of the Hebrew down, then this particular song is written in Yiddish. Can you tell us about maybe the etymology of the Yiddish? What is Yiddish?
Yiddish is a language that was spoken by the Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe. Most of them also spoke German or Polish or Russian or Hungarian, and many of the people, at least many of the men, knew enough Hebrew to read and probably to speak a little bit as well. Yiddish is written in Hebrew characters. It has many Hebrew words in it. So, for example, in Yiddish, there is a word Hanukkah. That's a Hebrew word. It's pronounced in Yiddish. In Eastern European Hebrew, it would be Chanukah, not Hanukkah. Part of the Yiddish vocabulary is Old French, part of it is German, part of it is Slavic, part of it is unique to those languages. I suspect that people who know some German and some Hebrew probably understand many of the words in the Dreydl song that you're singing.
Yeah, I found my language that I studied for a long time was German, and so following along, I could understand a lot, and there was a lot there, but there are some pronunciations that are considerably different.
Right, the pronunciations, and even within Yiddish, there were dialects from Galicia, which is the part of what had been Poland that was gobbled up by Austria at the end of the 18th century, and the Litvish, which was the part that was the northern part of what was gobbled up by the Tsarist Empire, and so on and so forth. There are many local dialects.
Another piece that we're singing that's not in Hebrew is in Ladino, and is Ocho Kandelikas. Can you tell us a little bit, again, about maybe the beginnings of that language? And again, it's kind of a combination of several languages, as I understand.
Well, Ladino is a term that originally probably was used for religious texts, which had the Hebrew, and then they had in Hebrew characters something that they called Ladino, so that the people whose Hebrew was not so good could read what we would call a translation. And because it was translating sacred text, they would use some of the sacred terms as they found it in the original. Much as some of your audience and many of your singers will know, occasionally classic Latin texts will have Greek words or other words, and you'll see that as well in many of the sacred types of texts. The Jewish community of Spain may date back to the 3rd or 4th Christian century, maybe even earlier than that. The local tradition among Spanish Jews is that it dates back to about 500 some odd BCE, refugees from the First Temple. But we have documentation from late Roman times, late antiquity. by the High Middle Ages, the 1200s and 1300s, the Iberian Jewish community, Iberian Peninsula Jewish community, was one of the world's largest. And between the middle of the 1300s and the end of the 1300s, where there were pogroms in many cities, and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, Spanish-speaking Jews left to go all over the world. And they continued to speak in a kind of Jewish Spanish dialect. And again, there are differences between Sarajevo and Saloniki and Bulgaria and northern Morocco and things like that. But it's basically Judeo-Spanish. It's Jewish Spanish. It's probably a lot closer, your Spanish speakers would say it's a lot closer to Spanish than the German Yiddish connection. And in the 21st and the late 20th century, there's probably a good reason for that. The Spanish-speaking Jews were up against many other Spanish-speaking people, and the uniqueness of the dialect was probably a lot less today than it had been. Partially it's because there are so many Yiddish speakers, and there weren't quite as many Judeo-Spanish speakers.
In the song, you'll hear kind of a countdown of lighting the different candles. Uno, dos, tres, and those of you who are Spanish speakers will be able to follow along and understand which candles we're lighting. So really exciting to do this repertoire. Our first one, and I'm looking for it right now. Tell us a little bit about Mise Yamaleo.
Mise Yamaleo is a religious poem. It's a very long religious poem. Josh Jacobson only said about 1/3 of it. It is from Morocco by a very prolific author named David ben Aharon ibn Hassin, David, the son of Aaron, either the son of or the family name Hassin, who wrote an awful lot. He wrote religious responses to issues. He wrote Bible commentaries. And I was able to find online a copy of his book of over 100 pages of religious poetry for all occasions, Sabbath and festivals. This is in a section on miracles in which he has a number of long religious poems about miracles. This one uses the basic story of the Hasmoneans, and who can recount the miracles that happened to the Hasmoneans? As is typical of a lot of this religious poetry, every verse begins with a letter which spells out altogether, I am David, the son of Aaron, the son of Hassin, Chazak, strength, which is very typical of this literature. Joshua Jacobson did not credit David Hassin, and the reason for that, the most likely reason for that is that in the past 20 years or more, the singing of traditional piyutim, the traditional religious poetry, has gained favor among secularists as well as religious people as an art form. And it very well may have been practiced by, this art form may have been practiced by some Moroccans prior to that time, but it probably is much more common today. And so he said a melody as it was being sung. I think he says the melody is traditional, it's what was heard.
That's what he mentions.
And I'm sure that's what it is. I don't know that I'd be able to find somebody who wrote the melody, but very often the words are searchable. And today we have, I think he published this quite a few years ago. Today we have very, very good search tools on the internet. And between the rise of the popularity of the piyut and something like HebrewBooks.org or archive.org, you can search PDFs, and it will recognize the letters, and you'll find things quickly.
You mentioned, we haven't talked about Joshua Jacobson. You've mentioned his name a couple of times, but Joshua Jacobson is really the curator of Jewish music. I mean, he is, at least for me, the go-to person when I'm thinking about putting together a program and is the expert in that field. Do you know Josh Jacobson?
Yes, I know Josh Jacobson, and we've been friendly for quite a few years. We brought him to Denver years ago. Actually, the ACDA brought him to Denver, and we convinced him to stick around a few days and do a program, curated program with the Colorado Hebrew Chorale, of which my wife is the conductor. Jacobson has been the conductor and music director of the Zamir Chorale of Boston, and has been singularly active in editing and composing and arranging Jewish music. He has a website of Jewish choral music, which is a wonderful resource for people who are interested in this material. And he's been active in organizations like the American Choral Directors Association, and been one of a very small number of professionals involved in Jewish choral music that have made this music so much more accessible to other choral organizations.
Absolutely, and I've had the pleasure of hearing Joshua speak many times at ACDA conferences, Chorus America conferences, and he's very accessible himself. I mean, to be able to email him and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this program, and he gets back to you right away. So he's just a real wonderful resource to have with this repertoire. You had mentioned earlier on, and it's a piece that we're singing on this program called Hanissim, if I pronounced that correctly, Hanissim. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. I know that, in fact, I think your wife had mentioned, I think I was there when he first taught this to a group of us.
Well, he first taught it to the group, although it had been something he had already written. There's a lot of stuff on the internet where people recall how, at that point, I think rabbinic student Dov Frimmer he was a performer of music, and there was some sort of a competition at Yeshiva University, and he dashed something off and was surprised when it won. And later on, when he had moved to Israel, he also said, well, let's submit this to the Hasidic Song Festival, and it received a great deal of popularity as well. I believe that Rabbi Frimmer is still among the living. I couldn't find anything to the contrary, and he apparently is a senior law partner in a firm in Jerusalem, as well as writing together with his brother on legal rabbinic aspects of things. I don't know that he's doing any music anymore. The text is from the prayer book. It is an addition to the basic prayer that's said in traditional Jewish circles 3 times a day, called the standing prayer or the prayer, which is the heart of the Jewish traditional service. And this is the line that begins the prayer that's added, the paragraph that's added for Hanukkah, for Purim, which is another great period of being saved from tragedy. And some synagogues add it also for Israel Independence Day.
And this is one that we repeat. It's kind of a very singable chorus, and we repeat it over and over again. And this is one we're joined with clarinet, and so
Right.
Really excited about that.
That's part of the style of the piece. The piece was written, I don't know what Frimmer's troupe was like. I couldn't find, sometimes you can find people who had, home cameras that made videos that are been put onto the internet. I couldn't find anything like that. Well, you laugh, but they exist. But the arrangement is done very much in a klezmer style with the clarinet there, and it's very typical of Hasidic music to have a line of a prayer text that's repeated over and over and over again.
So we might have our audience join along in singing by the time we get to the
Absolutely.
last verse of it. The other one that you mentioned, Aleih Neiri, which is like I said, all this repertoire is new to me, but this setting of this text is incredibly beautiful, and we were talking about it, and it features we're actually featuring 2 soloists on this piece singing the verses. The choir then joins in and singing one of the verses as well, but the choir is actually almost instrumental in just doing ding, 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 ding throughout as the soloists sing over that, and there's just such a magical sense about the piece. Is that reflective of the text itself?
Oh, that's a good question. The text was written, Jacobson credits it to Shin Shalom, a well-known Hebrew literary figure. I don't know that that's true. I found a reference to, I think his name is Avraham Indelman, who eventually wound up in the United States. But the text was written in the 1930s as a poem for children about lighting candles. Jacobson has a few other arrangements which have the tim, 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 the kind of bell-like quality. And I should note that Jacobson was doing this, as were others, well before the modern a cappella tradition of having, the chorus also be the orchestra. But there you have it. And the poem is a relatively simple poem. The melody was written by Chaim Parchi, who born in Yemen in the 1940s, moved to Israel, and eventually moved to Boston for his studies. And I'm sure Jacobson knew Parchi in Boston, traveling in the same circles, and I think even teaching in one of the same schools from time to time. But Parchi is not the only person to have said these words, but I think it's appropriate to the melody that Parchi had. I don't know whether Jacobson and Parchi actually collaborated on making the arrangement. That would be a question to ask Josh.
Well, it certainly has been great visiting with you, and before I let you go, we want to hear a little bit more about you. You've held quite a few titles and taught at many institutions across the Front Range, all the way from Wyoming down to here. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I have a couple of degrees from Yale University, including a PhD they're all in Near Eastern languages and literatures. And I have taught at the University of Haifa in Israel. I've taught at the University of Denver, where I taught for 10 years, and I was the director of the Institute for Islamic Judaic Studies. I taught until this past summer at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And when you talk about the Front Range, I taught very briefly in Colorado Springs and at CU Boulder, a number of other places around here. My fields are Jewish-Muslim interactions, both literary and to a certain extent in other areas, but in religion and I'll call it Islamic law and Jewish law. And for the past 20 or so years, I've been working with individuals who come from a Spanish background and see themselves as descendants of converso Jews who were either forced to leave Spain because they were afraid of the Inquisition but kept within the Spanish fold, or left Spain for money and glory in the New World, and kept willy-nilly some of the Jewish background, even though for the most part it was hidden on purpose because it was dangerous in Spain in Spanish realms in the 1500s and up to the early 1600s to be openly Jewish. In addition to that, my wife conducts the Colorado Hebrew Chorale, and I've done a lot of the background work to support some of the repertoire that the Hebrew Chorale performs.
Well, you've been such a great resource for us, and it's great to meet you and to glean just a little bit of your knowledge on this repertoire. I can't wait to do more Jewish music, and we've talked about doing some motets down the road, and I'm sure that we'll have an opportunity to cross paths again. So looking forward to our concerts this December 9 through 12, Miracles at venues across the Front Range almost. So thank you for joining me, Dr. Ward, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you.
A pleasure.